October 3, 1976. At a small construction site in Riverside, Illinois, the steady drone of an excavator cut through the chill of a Saturday morning. Around 10 o'clock, the steel bucket suddenly jolted to a stop. The operator thought he had struck a root or a buried stone, but with a few more scoops, the earth gave way. Pale fragments surfaced. Not rotted wood, not stone. Human bone. Work ceased immediately. Riverside police were called. Yellow tape went up around the site as neighbors gathered outside the fence, watching in silence. The first report, typed on a machine, was only a single line. Human remains discovered. Possible burial site. The bones were sent to the Cook County Medical Examiner's office. Under the sterile glow of white lights, a pathologist examined each piece carefully. The curve of the pelvis, the shape of the skull, all pointed to a female, 25 to 30 years old. Dental records were compared. The match was exact. Margaret Collins. Stage name, Maggie Cole, the lounge singer who had vanished from Riverside 20 years earlier. A case thought long buried had risen back from the ground. Margaret Collins was born in 1930 and raised in Riverside, a quiet town on the Des Plaines River. Its main street held a handful of small shops, a laundromat, a grocery, and an old cinema. Her father died when she was still a child. Maggie lived with her mother, Eleanor, in a red brick house where the porch light glowed each night without fail. Her younger brother, Robert, had a family of his own, but often returned to visit. Friends and neighbors remembered Maggie as disciplined, always punctual, always neat. A young woman who rarely drew attention to herself, who showed little emotion, yet when she stood on stage, her presence changed the room. Her voice was warm, low, tinged with sorrow, the kind of sound that lingered after she left. From 1953 onward, Maggie performed regularly at the Blue Orchid, a dim lounge half an hour outside Chicago. The room was dark, smoke curling through the air, glasses clinking softly, and within that haze her songs became part of the night itself. She was not a star across the state, but in Riverside, Maggie Cole was unforgettable. On the night of November 14, 1956, Maggie left home at 8. Eleanor remembered the pale gray sweater, the small black handbag. At the door, Maggie turned back and said simply, "I'll be back after midnight." By 8:30, she was at the Blue Orchid. The bartender recalled she ordered only hot tea, unlike many singers who reached for cocktails before a set. Frankie Doyle, her colleague that night, later said, "Everything seemed normal." Maggie sang 3 sets, ending at 12:20. Before stepping off stage, she told Doyle, "I'll call you tomorrow." Around 12:40, she walked out through the front door. That was the last time anyone could say they saw her. Outside, the narrow street stretched empty toward the highway. The street lamps cast their dull yellow light on damp sidewalks. The last patrons walked quickly to their cars, doors slamming, engines fading into silence. Staff cleared tables, emptied trash, locked side doors one by one. Riverside settled into stillness, broken only by the faint hum of distant engines. At 1 a.m., the neon sign flickered out. The pale blue glow on the sidewalk vanished. From that moment, Maggie's trail ended. One witness said he glimpsed a woman at the corner, standing as if waiting for a ride, but the memory was vague. Taxi logs from that night listed a fare at 1:15 a.m. Driver Joe Miller remembered taking a woman north. He could not recall her face. He kept no receipt. Time after that became a void. The next morning, staff reopened the club. The dressing room still smelled faintly of disinfectant. On a wooden chair lay a pair of black leather gloves, neatly placed, as if forgotten. In a locker, a wristwatch had stopped at 1:47. Her handbag was gone. No signs of struggle. No note. At 9, Eleanor called the police. Her voice trembled. Her daughter had left the night before, promised to be home after midnight, and by morning had not returned. Maggie's bedroom was untouched. On her vanity lay a tube of lipstick, a notebook of lyrics, and a calendar marked with an audition in Chicago that weekend. A young officer was dispatched. He noted the house undisturbed, the closet in order, every pair of shoes in place. Eleanor repeated only one thing: her daughter never left without a word. Case file 56-1123 was opened. The cold summary read, female, 26. Last seen 0040, the Blue Orchid. Items recovered: gloves, wristwatch stopped 147. No evidence of struggle. For 3 days, search teams spread out. Along the Des Plaines River, flashlights swept the water as dogs searched the banks. At Union Station, officers showed Maggie's photo to ticket clerks. None remembered her. Cars were stopped on the highway. Nothing. No bank activity. No phone calls. No letters. Maggie's timeline froze at midnight, November 14th. On November 17th, the local paper ran a small column. Local singer missing, Margaret Collins, 26, failed to return home after performance. Beside it, an ad for a department store and baseball scores. Her photo was taped to poles and diners across town, quickly smudging in the rain. Weeks later, speculation grew. She may have gone to New York in search of opportunity. She may have left with a man. No evidence supported it. The family resisted. Robert brought police an unsent letter, paper folded, handwriting slanted. In it, Maggie wrote about an upcoming radio audition. Robert insisted if she planned to leave, she wouldn't still be writing her plans. The letter was clipped into the file. On November 30th, a supplemental report was typed. No evidence of crime. Possible voluntary disappearance. File closed, pending new evidence. The 10-page report was filed in a steel cabinet, lost among hundreds of small cases. The name Margaret Collins faded into a single blurred line, and then, 20 years later, workers in Riverside struck bone. The question buried since 1956 returned, cold and unrelenting. If Margaret had disappeared by choice, why was her body lying deep in the ground? October 5th, 1976. 2 days after the discovery of the bones, Riverside police gathered in a small room to reopen the past. On the table lay a thin stack of 10 pages, file number 56-1123, pulled from a steel cabinet for the first time in 20 years. The paper had yellowed, the ink blurred in places, yet one line still stood out clearly. Investigation yields no evidence of crime. Possible voluntary disappearance. File closed, pending new evidence. The case was now in the hands of Detective Thomas Keene, a veteran of more than 15 years. He had never heard of Maggie Cole beyond a few scattered anecdotes from older colleagues. As he turned through the pages, he felt the weight of silence, nearly 2 decades with no investigation, broken only by a few lonely notes, like single dots scattered across a blank page. Case note, April 1957. No new leads. Community inquiries yielded nothing further. Case note, September 1960. Tip from Chicago resident proved false. Case remains closed. Case note, August 1968. Mother reported possible phone call from subject, unable to trace number, no action taken. And after that, nothing at all. Keene read slowly, as if studying a piece of music, stripped of melody, reduced to a few random notes. The disappearance of a 26-year-old woman had been pushed aside, while life in Riverside had moved on. Local newspapers mentioned Maggie a handful of times, then fell silent. In the Riverside Gazette of February 12, 1957, a single line appeared between ads for washing machines and used cars. Family continues to seek information about missing singer. No photo, no commentary. By the early 1960s, her name was gone from print. The younger generation had never even heard of her. The Blue Orchid, the lounge where Maggie sang her last songs, carried on. New smoke filled the air. New music replaced the old. Yet patrons who remembered felt the absence. One bartender recalled how, after each set, a few regulars still turned unconsciously toward the stage, waiting for a voice that never returned. By 1972, the familiar blue neon sign was taken down. It was tossed into a scrapyard, never to glow again. Those who came later knew only a bar with a new name, unaware that the place had once been the center of an unsolved disappearance. Inside the Collins family, the absence was present in every room, but never spoken aloud. Eleanor, Maggie's mother, kept the porch light burning every night. Even during blackouts, she placed a candle in a glass jar to shield it from the wind. "So she knows her way home," was all she ever said. One rainy evening, a photographer captured her silhouette framed by that dim glow, an image that would become the haunting emblem of the case. Robert, Maggie's younger brother, built a family of his own. Each time he visited, he avoided mentioning her name, yet often slipped. One night he opened a drawer, took out Maggie's unsent letter, paper folded, handwriting slanted. He read it aloud to his children as if it were a spelling lesson. The children repeated the words, unaware they belonged to a voice that would never be heard again. For Robert, it was the only way to keep his sister present. Beyond the family, her disappearance became a whisper that thinned with time. In a cafe near the Riverside station, some said she had run off with a musician. Others muttered about debts. None of it was proven, none of it named. By the late 1960s, even the whispers had faded. An old customer once remembered hearing two teenagers ask, "Who was Maggie Cole?" The question slipped away in the hiss of a coffee machine. Meanwhile, file 56-1123 sat untouched in the cabinet. From time to time, a new officer would pull it out, flip a page or two, then slide it back. The typewritten notes felt foreign now, relics of a time already gone. In the small conference room of Riverside Police in 1976, Keene placed the file on the table. He asked quietly, "If this was a voluntary disappearance, then why do we have a body?" No one answered. The silence stretched on, like the empty decades in the file. In his notebook, Keene wrote his first line. Need to reconstruct timeline 1956 to 1976. Focus on family records, community changes, forgotten witnesses. Days later, Chicago newspapers revived the story. On page 2 of the Tribune, a headline read, "Human remains in Riverside may be linked to missing singer from 1956. Elderly residents dug through their fading memories. They spoke of nights when Maggie sang, of crowds at the Blue Orchid. But their voices trembled, their recollections uncertain. Police informed Eleanor. She asked only one question. Did she suffer? No one could answer. Robert remained silent. He remembered the morning in 1956 when he walked into his sister's room and found her wristwatch stopped at 1:47. 20 years later, the memory was unchanged, except that now the watch was no longer a riddle, but a piece of evidence beside a skeleton. For the police, the discovery of the bones did more than reopen a file. It exposed a paradox. Riverside had changed across 2 decades. New roads, new shops, new families. But the disappearance remained frozen, a line in a forgotten file. That silence had now broken open, revealing what had been buried beneath the earth. In the dim archives, Keene set file 56-1123 beside old clippings. He knew from this point forward the story had to be rewritten. The question was no longer, where did Maggie go? It had become, who put her in the ground and why? Outside, the excavator still hummed at the Riverside site. The earth was not finished revealing what it had hidden for 20 years. October 6, 1976. The Riverside construction site remained silent, work suspended. A wooden fence circled the ground, guarded at night to keep the curious away. Outside, children from the town gathered, peering through gaps in the boards. Inside, the earth, still unsettled, had already become a crime scene. A forensic team arrived from Chicago. Heavy machinery was set aside. In its place came small shovels, soft brushes. Each layer of soil was lifted slowly, carefully. A recorder stood close, marking every location. A clear plastic box was prepared for whatever fragments emerged. The body had long since decomposed. Only bones remained. Yet the posture drew immediate attention. The skeleton was laid out neatly, arms placed along the sides, the skull facing west. This was not the chaos of a landslide or an accident. One examiner murmured, "Position suggests deliberate burial." Around the main frame, fragments were scattered, likely shattered by the excavator, but the skeleton itself was intact. It lay nearly 2 meters deep, not a natural pit, a grave. As they worked, details surfaced. A gray scrap of fabric, rotted and fraying at the edges. The color matched the sweater Maggie had worn the night she disappeared. A broken zipper, rusted, torn from its garment. A plain ring of cheap alloy, the kind sold in roadside shops in the 1950s. No inscription. A plastic comb, snapped in two. Brittle strands of hair still caught between its teeth. And then the most unsettling find. A folded slip of paper, pressed into the soil beside the ribs. The earth around it was damp and rotted, yet the paper itself held firm, its creases intact, only stained by faint yellow blotches. When opened, the faded words were still legible. Riverside Cleaners, November 13, 1956. Customer, M. Collins. One examiner wrote quietly, "Condition of document inconsistent with 20 years underground." Paper left in damp soil for 2 decades should have dissolved to pulp. Yet here the folds remained sharp, the print still visible. So the question emerged, had that receipt lain with the bone since 1956? Or had someone placed it there later? And if someone returned, what was the purpose? To point investigators toward a trail, or to remind them that Maggie had never truly left Riverside. All bones and objects were sealed, transported to the Cook County Medical Examiner's office. The case was now in the hands of Dr. Evelyn Hart. Her preliminary report read, sex, female. Estimated age, 25 to 30. Time of death, more than 20 years ago, consistent with 1956. Identification, dental records from 1954 matched exactly to Margaret Collins. But Hart's attention fixed on the skull. At the back, a fracture spread outward like a spider web, running deep into the base. She wrote, "Blunt force trauma." Consistent with strike from heavy object. Something hard, narrow in surface, had struck the back of her head. But what kind of object? A hammer? A bottle? The corner of a table? Hart would not say. Her report offered only, object undetermined. The ribs told another story. 2 small parallel fractures, close together. Hart noted, not consistent with soil pressure. In other words, not the slow crush of earth. More likely an impact while alive, or just after death. She added, sequence uncertain, could be peri or post-mortem. The report did not solve the mystery, but it made one fact undeniable. Margaret Collins had not died naturally. Her death bore the mark of violence. On October 9th, Eleanor and Robert were summoned to the Riverside Police Station. The room was lit by the harsh flicker of fluorescent bulbs, the ceiling humming faintly. On the table, 3 clear evidence bags were set in a row, a scrap of gray fabric, a dull metal ring, and the stained receipt. Eleanor stepped forward. She bent to look at the fabric, her eyes stopping at a loose stitch. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "That's her sweater. I remember sewing the button back on that week." Robert recognized the receipt. He remembered giving Maggie the coins that day. The room was silent, broken only by the scratching of a pen as an officer took notes. Eleanor lowered herself into a chair, her eyes locked on the faded cloth. Robert stood behind her, arms crossed, staring at the receipt. Neither spoke. The next morning, the Chicago Tribune ran the story. Page 2, above a used car advertisement, carried a photograph of the broken comb laid against a black background. The headline read, "Clues suggest foul play in singer's death." After 20 years, Maggie Cole's name returned to print, not in the entertainment section, but in crime and courts. On October 12th, Detective Keene filed his memorandum to superiors. His final line read, "Position of remains, associated clothing fragments, and evidence of blunt force trauma contradict prior hypothesis of voluntary disappearance. Case reclassified, homicide." With one sentence, the old theory collapsed. Maggie had not walked away. She had been killed. In Riverside, the town stirred again. A cafe near the station pinned up the newspaper, Maggie's 1955 photograph staring back at familiar faces. An old patron murmured, "All these years, we thought she left." Turns out she never did. Eleanor shut her door against reporters. Robert refused to comment, saying only, "She was supposed to sing in Chicago that weekend." Pressure now fell on the police. Who had buried Maggie? Why did the laundry receipt look so new? And why had the body been placed so carefully, as if someone meant to conceal her, yet also leave behind a sign? On October 14th, the file was renumbered, 76-1006. The old 10 pages were clipped to the new reports, bound in red cover. Keene's last note read, "Re-examined circle of acquaintances, co-workers, family. Cross-reference with timeline November 14th, 1956. The clatter of typewriters echoed through the records room. Outside, the construction site had been leveled again, but every eye was fixed on the past. The case was no longer a disappearance. It was now a murder." October 15th, 1976. The case file of Margaret Collins was officially reopened. In a small room inside Riverside Police Headquarters, Detective Thomas Keene laid the old 10-page dossier on the table. The paper was yellowed, the typewritten ink blurred, the title still visible on the cover. Missing person, Collins, Margaret, 26. Now a new stamp cut across it in red. Reclassified, homicide. Keene drew a line across the first page. He looked at the small team gathered before him and said evenly, 20 years later, we treat it as day one. Everyone around her is a suspect." They began to reconstruct the night of November 14th, 1956, 8:30 p.m. Maggie entered the Blue Orchid, ordered a cup of hot tea. Midnight, she finished her last set, told colleague Frankie Doyle, "I'll call you tomorrow." 12:40 a.m. Doyle claimed he saw her leave through the front door, but the bartender did not confirm it. Neither did the patrons. A waitress recalled that near midnight, Arthur Hayes, the owner, was still walking near the bar. That directly contradicted his statement that he had left before then. And there was another figure, an unnamed man in a dark coat and fedora, sitting alone near the window. One witness remembered him leaving at the same time Maggie vanished. On the whiteboard, Keene wrote 3 names: Doyle, Hayes, unknown male. 3 names, 3 lives, tied to the last night of a young singer. Frankie Doyle, her colleague, her fellow performer. Old rumors whispered he once confessed feelings for Maggie, only to be turned down. Jealousy, if true, could have sparked conflict in the dark of the dressing room. Arthur Hayes, the manager, known for debts, linked to Chicago loan sharks. Financial records showed he mortgaged his house only months after Maggie disappeared. His alibi, that he left the bar at 11 o'clock, was unraveling. The unidentified man, existing only in the vague memory of a witness. A fedora, A shadow leaving through the door. No name, no license plate, only a blank space. The deeper Keene dug, the more holes appeared in the 1956 file. Doyle said Maggie left through the door. The bartender never saw her. Hayes said he left at 11 o'clock. A witness remembered him after midnight. The old report said, no evidence of violence. Yet the exhumed skull bore a massive fracture. The file once noted, no personal effects recovered. Now they had fabric, a ring, a comb, even a receipt preserved for 20 years. In his notebook, Keene wrote, "Case likely suppressed or mishandled in 1956. Possible external influence." News of the excavation spread through Riverside. Memories resurfaced. An elderly woman told the local paper she saw a woman like Maggie leave the club quickly, stepping into a black car parked in front. That detail had never appeared in the file. Another man remembered that, days later, the Blue Orchid closed for floor repairs. When it reopened, the board shone, unnaturally new. It was brand new, he said. Nobody knew why. In the archives, Keene found the receipt. Floor replacement, November 16, 1956, paid in cash. The paper was faded, but the date clear. 2 days after Maggie disappeared. The police turned back to the family. Robert Collins, the brother, was questioned about the laundry receipt found in the grave, its condition far too fresh to have spent 2 decades underground. If it had not decayed, then someone had kept it safe and placed it later. When pressed, Robert said only, "She was supposed to pick it up the next day." Keene made no accusations, but he wrote in his notes, "Family not excluded. Motive unclear, but opportunity possible." Eleanor, Maggie's mother, refused interviews. She offered only one sentence: "My daughter never left this town." On November 2, 1976, Keene presented his findings to the department. The receipt for the floor repairs at the Blue Orchid, dated just 2 days after Maggie vanished. His report concluded, "Timeline suggests crime may have occurred inside the Blue Orchid, burial likely secondary. Key persons, Doyle, Hayes, unidentified male. Re-examine all." That night, the file was closed with a question still hanging in the air. If the lounge itself was where Maggie died, who decided the evidence had to be erased? And why was the secret kept beneath new floorboards for 20 years? November 5, 1976. The second-floor conference room at Riverside Police Headquarters was flooded with harsh fluorescent light, the kind that made the place feel more like a hospital ward than a station. Detective Thomas Keene set the file down on the table, its pages marked with colored tabs, notes jutting out like scars. His voice was steady, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "We have 2 stories. Either she died in a moment of passion, or she was silenced with intent. Our task is to see which story holds." On the board, he wrote 2 phrases: crime of passion and organized concealment. 2 paths, one a personal tragedy, the other a calculated design. The first path, death born of passion. Frankie Doyle's name surfaced immediately. He was Maggie's partner on stage, and the only person who claimed to have seen her walk out the front door at 12:40 a.m. No one else remembered it. Not the bartender, not a single patron. His words stood alone, floating in the emptiness. Old rumors returned. Doyle had cared for Maggie more than she ever returned. A waitress had once said, "Everyone knew Frankie pursued her. Everyone knew she would never say yes." Rejection, coupled with the spotlight tilting toward Maggie, was enough to wound a singer's pride, to make him feel invisible. The fracture in her skull, the clean break at the back of her head, pointed toward a heavy blow. The ribs, snapped in parallel lines, looked less like the weight of earth, more like violence in life. Doyle, in a flash of jealousy, could have struck her in the dressing room. But then came the gap. If this was only a fit of anger, who moved the body? Who buried it at a construction site? and who paid to have the bar's floorboards replaced 2 days later. Doyle was a young singer, without money, without influence, and above all, who kept a laundry receipt for 20 years only to place it beside her bones. The second path, deliberate concealment. Arthur Hayes, owner of the Blue Orchid, emerged as a darker figure. His statement placed him out of the bar by 11. Yet one witness swore he saw Hayes well after midnight, the very hour Maggie disappeared. Hayes carried debts, the kind owed to Chicago's loan sharks. Rumors tied his lounge to clean money, accounts always too balanced to be honest. If Maggie had seen something she was not meant to, she might have become a liability. The receipt for floor repairs, dated November 16th, paid in cash, an unusually high sum, was like a black mark on the file. Locals remembered the boards gleaming, the air smelling of glue when the club reopened. If this was a silencing, then the grave in Riverside was only a cover. The real crime scene had been scrubbed, plank by plank, until the blood was gone. And yet, Maggie was a lounge singer. She had no ties to organized crime. Could a woman vanish simply for stepping into the wrong room? The laundry receipt, a restless piece of paper. Pulled from the dirt, it was still intact, still creased. The coroner's note was blunt. Condition inconsistent with 20 years underground. One possibility, someone kept it dry, hidden in a wallet, a drawer, an envelope, and placed it in the grave years later. Another, a hand deliberately staged the scene, inserting the receipt as if to anchor the timeline. Keene wrote in his notebook, "Receipt suggests staging." Whoever kept it kept the story alive. Riverside was divided. Some believed Doyle killed her in a jealous rage. The Tribune ran the headline, "Jealous singer may have killed partner." Others insisted the crime was bigger, tied to Chicago's underworld. The Sun-Times printed it colder. Mob connection possible in 1956, death. In the red brick house of the Collins family, the porch light still burned every night. Robert told reporters, "My sister just wanted to sing. She wasn't part of any crime." Eleanor said nothing, an unexpected clue. On November 12th, investigators searching through the tape archives of a local radio station found an old reel marked, "The Blue Orchid, Rehearsal, November 1956. Most of it was rehearsal noise, but near the end, voices cut through. A man's voice, identified as Frankie Doyle. "You think you can just walk away?" Then a woman's voice, strikingly like Maggie's. "I told you, Frankie." And then silence. No one knew when the exchange was recorded or in what context, but it confirmed one thing: Maggie and Doyle had argued on the eve of her disappearance. Keene's memo that day was short, typed in the same clipped rhythm as all the rest. Two paths diverge, jealousy or cover-up. Both partly true, neither complete. Receipt remains the outlier. Tape suggests confrontation. The question stands, whose story are we really hearing? November 20th, 1976. In the basement of a yellow brick building on Dearborn Street, Chicago, the air was heavy with the blend of old paint, chemical residue, and paper gone stale. Fluorescent bulbs flickered faintly, buzzing like static. On a long steel table lay 4 evidence bags, a gray scrap of cloth, a tarnished ring, a broken comb, and a laundry receipt. Fragile paper, yet now the keystone of an entire case. 3 specialists worked in turn. The whisper of rubber gloves, the tap of a pencil against metal, the scrape of tweezers on plastic, sounds of a crime brought back to life. Dr. Lawrence Hart, leading the team, lifted the receipt carefully. He noted the creases, sharp, deep, as if it had once lived folded in a wallet or an envelope. The fibers were intact, unnaturally preserved for something said to have been buried 20 years. Ink analysis revealed a faint blur at the corner. The conclusion: degradation consistent with early 1960s moisture, not 1956 burial. In other words, The paper had not spent 2 decades underground. It had aged elsewhere in damp storage before being placed in the grave. A faint pencil X in the corner, under magnification, matched handwriting samples from the notebook of Edward Collins, a local laborer. What lingered most was the smell, not earth, not decay, but the dry mustiness of a storage box. Hart wrote it plainly. Receipt reflects not victim's life, but another hand. The paper did not belong to Maggie's final night. It belonged to someone else who had kept it, then chosen to let it fall into the dirt beside her bones. The trail led investigators back to Riverside Cleaners. A worn sign still hung above the door. The owner, Martinez, now old and retired, remembered clearly the rhythms of his early years. He led police to a metal box in the storeroom, stuffed with receipts folded into tight bundles. Some had disintegrated, others remained intact, their condition eerily similar to the one pulled from the grave. The delivery boy handled these, Martinez recalled. Sometimes he kept them too long before dropping them in the box. The employee list from 1956 gave a name, Edward Collins. Delivery boy, collector of slips and clothing. That name surfaced again in the records of Midwest Contractors, the firm that replaced the floor at the Blue Orchid on November 16, 1956, just 2 days after Margaret vanished. The payment was in cash, off the books. The signature on the receipt, Edward. In Edward's old notebook, investigators found the entry. Work at Orchid, cover floor, Hayes paid extra. Something spilled. The handwriting was uncharacteristically slow, deliberate. Pressed between those pages was a small gray fiber, later confirmed to be of the same fabric found with Maggie's remains. Back in 1956, Edward had claimed he was at home that night. His wife supported the alibi, but only in a single line, with no detail. 2 decades later, their son, now grown, told police, "Dad used to mention working nights at the club when I was little, said he got extra cash for a messy job." A throwaway memory that cracked the old testimony wide open. The notebook carried more than words. On its final page, a brown stain, thin and faded. Testing suggested diluted blood, too degraded for identity, but still preserved. On the cover, a scrawled M. No explanation offered. The Collins family, once the grieving voice demanding answers, now stood uncomfortably close to suspicion. Robert Collins, Maggie's younger brother, had never appeared in any transaction. Yet his cousin Edward had touched both critical points, the laundry and the floor replacement. Keene noted, "No evidence Robert involved?" But silence within family notable. Possible unspoken knowledge? Eleanor, Maggie's mother, nearly 70, gave only a shake of her head when asked about Edward. "He was always around," she said softly. But Maggie never spoke of him much. Her answer closed no doors. Meanwhile, the old suspects dimmed. Doyle, once seen through the lens of jealousy, had no direct tie to the evidence. Hayes, the owner, lingered in testimony, but the material traces no longer pointed his way. The fibers, the pencil mark, the receipt, all led back to Edward Collins. By late November, Keene typed his reassessment. Victim last seen in Hayes's office. Floor replacement consistent with concealment. Workers' notes confirm irregular payment. Receipt preservation indicates deliberate placement. Fiber and handwriting link Edward Collins to concealment. Implication: Edward Collins not only concealed, but possibly present at critical time. He sat in the quiet after typing, the fluorescent hum constant above him. On the final page, he struck the keys slowly, one line at a time. The Blue Orchid was not only her last stage, it was a stage managed after death. And Edward Collins, with paper, pencil, and silence, may have written more of the story than anyone else. November 28, 1976. 20 years after Maggie vanished, the interrogation room in Riverside was bare, one steel table, a flicker of sickly green fluorescent light. Edward Collins sat hunched, shoulders trembling. In front of him, Keene laid the evidence one by one: the gray scrap of cloth, the notebook, the laundry receipt. "You can't deny this anymore," Keene said, his voice flat. "Your handwriting, the bloodstain, the fiber in your book, everything ties you to the Blue Orchid that night." Edward stayed silent, his eyes bloodshot, the look of a man who had not slept in days. At last, in a cracked whisper, he said, "I didn't kill her. I only cleaned." Keene leaned closer. "Who told you to?" Edward closed his eyes, the words breaking as if dragged out of him. "Hayes." It was him. "When I came in, she was already on the floor, blood pooling on the carpet. He said, 'An accident, just clean it up. No one can know.'" In the transcript, the summary line read only, "Subject admits concealment. Names Hayes as principal actor." Edward's words drew a spotlight onto Richard Hayes, the owner of the Blue Orchid. Outwardly polished, always in pressed suits, Hayes had long been whispered about. Debts from gambling, ties to underworld cash. Maggie had often been summoned to his office to collect her pay. According to Edward, it was there she overheard a conversation, Hayes discussing a deal that wasn't clean. Perhaps she reacted. Perhaps she threatened to walk away. For Hayes, even that possibility was a risk. That night, when Maggie stepped off stage, she did not head for the front door. She walked into Hayes's office, and that was the last moment anyone saw her alive. In his confession, Edward admitted the receipt was never Maggie's. Hayes gave it to him days later, ordering him to bury it with the body. "This paper will make them believe she was still alive on the 13th, doing errands. Keep them away from this office." Forensics in 1976 confirmed it. The ink had degraded like paper stored in damp boxes of the early 1960s, not like something buried since 1956. The receipt was not a trace of Maggie's life, but a piece of stagecraft. In December, police came to Hayes's house in Milwaukee. He opened the door in a gray suit, the air of cigarettes and polished wood around him. Keene slid Edward's statement across the table. "He says you killed Maggie Cole, that you paid him to change the floor, to bury the body." Hayes smirked, poured himself a drink, and spoke slowly. "Edward is a coward. If I paid him, it was to clean up my club. A singer collapsing in an office? Tragic, yes. But accidents happen, and it's been 20 years. What do you expect of me now?" His lawyer stepped in before the questions could press deeper. There was no weapon, no direct witness, no fingerprints, only the words of an accomplice, tainted by self-preservation. The 1976 file closed with the line, "Insufficient evidence to indict Richard Hayes." When police relayed the news, Eleanor sat motionless, staring out a winter window. Robert gripped the chair beside her. The old mother asked only one thing. Then who gives her back the truth? There was no answer. Newspapers printed a brief line. Hayes questioned in Singer's death. No charges filed. Neighbors skimmed it, folded the page. For them, Maggie's case had already become the dust of history. Edward returned home. The neighborhood never called him a murderer, but never forgave him either. He lived the next years quietly, rarely leaving his porch. Neighbors said he sat for hours, staring into nothing. Sometimes he whispered, "I didn't kill her. I just cleaned." His son remembered how Edward scribbled on scraps of paper the letter M over and over without explanation. He stopped working. Doctors later wrote, "Post-traumatic disorder, paranoid tendencies." He was never the same again. At the end of 1976, Keene typed his final report. The last line read, "The Blue Orchid was not only her last stage, it became the stage for her silence. Hayes held the curtain. Edward moved the props. And for 20 years, the play remained unseen. The Blue Orchid closed in 1977, The neon sign was pulled down. Hayes lived a few more years, never tried in court. Maggie Cole, the 26-year-old lounge singer, remained only as a fading memory. On her grave in Riverside Cemetery, the stone bore a single line, "Her song unfinished." On December 6, 1976, just 8 days after the interrogation in Milwaukee, Richard Hayes collapsed with chest pain and was pronounced dead at St. Mary's Hospital. The official note read, "Subject Hayes, deceased before charges could be filed." There was no large funeral, only a lawyer, a handful of relatives. His name disappeared from the headlines as quickly as it had returned. For Edward Collins, the end was slower. He remained alive, but diminished, haunted by his own silence. The man who buried evidence could not bury his own mind. The final line in the file was written with the weight of inevitability. The stage ended without applause. The man who held the curtain fell in silence. The one who moved the props lost his mind. And the singer, Margaret Collins, remained unfinished.